Good evening, Carson Bible Church. It is Wednesday and it's time for our weekly prayer meeting time. Last week we looked at an Advent passage from Isaiah chapter 7. Today we're going to look at another Advent passage from Isaiah chapter 9. So if you have your Bibles open to Isaiah chapter 9, I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Well, if you remember from when we were talking about Isaiah chapter 7, this is all being preached and taught at a time of great political turmoil and upheaval in Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. King Ahaz is under threat from rival neighbors who would intervene and remove him from power and replace him with someone that they find more aligned with their interests because they want to form a coalition to unite together and try to stop the nation of Assyria, which is growing in power and starting to threaten all of them. And Isaiah had some promises for King Ahaz. And really the exhortation was to trust in God, was for Ahaz and for the nation to return to God. And then in the following chapters, in the rest of chapter 7 and in chapter 8, and we see that Isaiah uses a number of metaphors and continues to give a number of exhortations. Those rival nations actually will fall, and they will no longer be a threat to the kingdom of Judah. But Assyria is still growing in power and really is this regional superpower that is still going to be a threat to Judah. And Isaiah uses these metaphors where instead of the people choosing to have a peaceful river, they instead choose a torrential flood. Instead of the people choosing God's light, they actually choose darkness. Instead of choosing to seek God and his wisdom and his guidance, they actually choose rather to use mediums to try to speak to the dead and get wisdom and insight from the dead rather than from God. And so God actually says that it's going to go pretty rough for all of them because of those things that they've chosen. They've chosen not to turn to him. But then we get this hope that comes in chapter 9, where it says, there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. And we get these areas mentioned that are pretty badly devastated by Assyria, and we're told then that in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. And of course, that is where we see a lot of Jesus's ministry in Galilee, here called Galilee of the Nations, sometimes called Galilee of the Gentiles. And we get this really beautiful prophecy of hope and of rejoicing. We're told that the people who have sought God, they rejoice as in a harvest time. They rejoice as being victorious in battle. We're told here these well-known verses, verse 6 and 7, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness. From this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." And so at this time of Advent, we remember that even in the midst of darkness, when people would choose darkness rather than light, even in the midst of overwhelming flood, when people would rather drown than choose the peaceful stream that God would offer them, with people preferring to choose mediums and other forms of sorcery rather than just to seek God in his word. As bad as things get and as dark as things look, there is hope. And God promises here that a Redeemer will shine God's light into their darkness. And that's exactly what we see in Jesus's birth, right? As we see that the light of Christ is shown into humanity's darkness. And a number of assurances here, especially for Isaiah's time, but also for our time too, is we're told that of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it. And from this time forth and forevermore, is that God himself will reign as king, and he will establish a kingdom that is greater than any of the other threats around them, whether that's Assyria or any other, and that it is a kingdom that will be established and will reign in justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. It's an endless kingdom, and it's a kingdom that can't be shaken and it can't be conquered. And we're just told these things about Jesus. Wonderful Counselor. Being wonderful means that it's never mundane or boring, right? Him as our King being our counselor, meaning that there's no need for anxiety or fear. Mighty God is that Jesus really is God himself, everlasting Father. And I know sometimes this may be confusing when we think about Jesus as the second person of the Trinity. That phrase doesn't equate Jesus with the Father, as the roles of the Trinity are distinct, but meaning that he's the origin of everything that's everlasting, is really what it means. And so the only things that are eternal are things that come from and through Jesus, Prince of Peace. I feel like, especially in Isaiah's time, but also in our time too, we just want peace, right? We feel like there's so much unrest all around us, and it would be nice if there was just peace. And that's exactly what we're promised in this endless kingdom of Christ. This passage points not only to Jesus's first advent, his birth as a human baby, but really it also points to his return in when his kingdom is established more fully here on earth, when his justice and righteousness will be seen and will be enacted in very tangible ways when his enemies are ultimately put under his feet, and those of us who are citizens in his kingdom will rejoice. If you today feel overwhelmed and feel like you're drowning in the world around us, if you feel like we are all just stumbling in darkness, and you long for God's light to shine into our world, meditate on this passage, spend some time in prayer, and I hope that you're encouraged at the time of Advent to remember that the light of Christ has shone into our darkness, and one day we look forward to the time when Christ will return, and again that all enemies will be put under his feet, and we who are recipients of his salvation, who look to him as our Redeemer, will rejoice, and we will reign with him from now until forever. I pray that you would find some encouragement there in this season. God bless you. We'll see you soon.